The Fort Wayne Story, with Glenn Stille, curator of military history, and Robert E. Lee, exhibits preparator at the Fort Wayne Military Museum.
The Fort Wayne Story. The Fort Wayne Story is the military history of Detroit. Many young men, particularly those of the Korean War period, remember Fort Wayne as a place where they received a physical examination and were inducted into the Army. I might say I had this same experience. These young men, who spent only a few hours on the military post, learned nothing of the background, the history, or the duties of the Fort Wayne Military Reservation, nor the Fort Wayne Military Museum. By looking at this diagrammatic map, we find that the fort was located on West Jefferson at the foot of Cavalry Avenue, 3 blocks east of Livernois in Detroit. Many people in the Detroit area are not aware of the fact that there is a museum in this area. The Fort Wayne Military Museum was established in 1949, just 100 years after completion of the old fort. The United States government had declared the 15 acres on which the old fort stands as surplus property. The city of Detroit agreed to take over the historic portion of the fort. It was placed under the direction of the Historical Commission, and this commission was given the responsibility of maintaining the property as an historical monument. The purpose of this museum is to preserve the military history of Detroit and Michigan. Through the museum's exhibit program, the story of this phase of history is told. Fort Wayne was not the first fort to be built at Detroit. To better understand the military history of this area, it is necessary to go back into history to the year 1701. In 1701, Detroit was founded by Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac. After receiving a grant of land from King Louis XIV of France, Cadillac arrived in the New World to establish a fur trading post and a fort to control the western Great Lakes for France. After choosing a site at the narrowest point on the Detroit River, Cadillac started to build a fort which he called Fort Pontchartrain. This fort was named for Count Pontchartrain, then the French colonial minister of Marine. Cadillac had been accompanied on his trip by soldiers, artisans, and Indians. Compared with the present location in Detroit, this fort stood where the Veterans Memorial Building now stands in the Civic Center. Cadillac enticed Indians of the Huron, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Chippewa, and Miami tribes to build villages near the fort for their mutual protection and to help him establish his fur trading industry. These Indians hunted for furs in the Michigan and Ontario wilderness and traded them at the fort for guns, ammunition, clothing, flour, trinkets, and many other such items. Fort Pontchartrain, during the French occupation from 1701 to 1760, was expanded at least 3 times. This model shows how it may have looked sometime during this period. Research material is very scarce on Fort Pontchartrain, and no contemporary drawings are available showing the fort. Quarters for the soldiers and civilian population, for the most part, were within the fort, but soon after the building of the fort, farms were established up and down the riverbank. After the fall of Montreal in the final days of the French and Indian War in 1759, France surrendered Detroit to the British, who took command in 1760. Fort Pontchartrain was used by the British troops until 1778. Fort Lernoult was built under the command of Captain Richard B. Lernoult, the British commandant at Detroit in 1778. The center of this fort, which was located at the corner of Fort and Shelby Streets in downtown Detroit. Old Fort Pontchartrain had been enlarged to accommodate 75 or 80 houses by the British after 1760, and in 1778 was refortified to meet a threat by Colonel George Rogers Clark and Colonel Daniel Broadhead, commanding American troops during the Revolutionary War. No attack developed, however, and the additional fortifications were never needed by the British. For 15 years, the British continued to control Detroit and the western Great Lakes. Finally, after General Anthony Wayne, leading his troops through Ohio and northern Indiana, defeated the Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the British at Detroit surrendered the fort to the Americans in July 1796. During the War of 1812, the Americans surrendered Detroit to the British for a period of 13 months. After the sea battle of Lake Erie, Detroit was again returned to the Americans in 1813. Immediately after the War of 1812, Fort Lernoult was renamed Fort Shelby in honor of Governor Shelby of Kentucky, who had sent troops to help relieve Detroit during the war. By 1818, the fort was falling into a state of disrepair, and in 1826, the final auction of pickets and other building materials was held, and the last federal troops departed. Thus ended the first 125 years of fortifications on the American side of the Detroit River. Fort Wayne, 1848. But what happened during the period just prior to the building of Fort Wayne? For 20 years after the demolition of Fort Lernoult, there was no fort at Detroit. Federal troops were stationed in Detroit, however, in the Detroit barracks, which was located at Gratiot Avenue at Russell. Captain Ulysses S. Grant, later to become world-renowned as a Civil War, as a Union general, and still later elected President of the United States, was commandant of this military installation for a time in the 1840s. In the late 1830s, the Patriot War was raging in Canada. This uprising was a rebellion against the Crown of England, much like our American Revolution. There were a few outbursts of violence, a few shots fired here and there, but on the whole, no full-scale war developed. However, on the American side of the international border, there were many sympathizers with the Canadian cause. This sympathy arose among Americans from the fact that we had won our independence from Great Britain some 60 years before. In 1840, the United States Congress found that our border was particularly vulnerable to attack from Canada. About this time, money was appropriated and a string of forts along the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence was planned. Fort Wayne was one of these. The fort at Detroit was built primarily as a defensive measure in case England should attack the United States. Construction was begun in 1843 and completed in 1849. By the time the fort was built, the Patriot War in Canada had ended, and there was never a need for the facilities at Fort Wayne. I might say that Fort Wayne has never fired a shot in anger, nor has it ever been fired upon. Now let us take a closer look at a model of old Fort Wayne. This gives us an idea of how the fort looks from the air. The general shape of the fort is a four-pointed star, which I think is the best way to describe it. The walls are surrounded by a dry moat. Earth embankments add bulk to the walls. To the south, the riverside of the fort is the demoloon. This is a V-shaped projection on which guns were mounted to fire at enemy shipping on the river. A powder magazine also was built outside the walls of the fort to supply the powder and ammunition for the guns on the demoloon. The external walls of the fort were so designed as to keep the amount of damage done by direct hit from cannon fire to a minimum. Cannonballs would ricochet because of the angle at which the walls were set. Of course, under today's technically advanced artillery barrages, the fort probably would not stand up for long. But for the type and power of artillery of the days when this fort was built, it could probably stand up for quite a while under fire. I have already mentioned that the fort has never been fired upon, nor has it ever fired a shot. On the embankments of the fort may be seen the stone mountings for the large artillery pieces which would be permanently mounted. since there were no hostilities in the offing at the conclusion of the construction, these guns were never mounted. The only records available to us is that during the Civil War, 6 small brass cannon on wheels were brought into the fort, and that was the extent of any heavy artillery ever at the fort. The entrance tunnel to the fort led through the east wall, made a right-angle turn, and continued for about 100 feet until it emerged on the edge of the parade ground. Off this tunnel is a casemate, which we will see in a little more detail later. In the southwest corner of the compound, or parade ground, is the powder magazine. On the west side is the 3 1/2-story barracks building in which the troops were housed. We have now seen what the fort looks like from the air. Now let's take a closer look at the various parts of the fort. The dry moat of the fort was used as part of the defense structure of the fort. The outer embankment protects the walls from bombardment, as well as making an obstacle for infantry troops to charge. The defile between the embankment and the fort wall was designed to develop a crossfire up and down the moat, discouraging an assault on the walls or entrance tunnels. This moat never carried water, nor was it intended to hold water. The moat is well above the water level of the Detroit River, which runs on the south side of the fort. The walls of the fort, as seen here, are 17.5 feet high, 7.5 feet thick, and measure 2,200 feet about the perimeter. The thickness of the wall is made up of 6 feet of stone, faced with 18 inches of brick. Pictured here is one of the 2 tunnel entrances to the fort. The doors are 6 inches thick of solid oak. There appears in each pair of doors a small door for pedestrian traffic. This is our main entrance to the Fort Wayne Military Museum. There are 2 sets of doors within the tunnel. The second set is located about 20 feet behind the first. In case of attack, both sets would be barred. Should the attacker batter down the first set, the second presented another obstacle. Once inside the first door, the enemy would be under fire from openings in the wall between the 2 sets of doors. Additional protection is thus provided for by the double barricade. The tunnel was used as a pedestrian as well as a wagon entrance. Scratches can still be seen on the brickwork where wagons failed to clear the turn. Exhibits have been set up in the tunnel, which we shall refer to in a few moments. The brickwork in the tunnel is confined to the arched ceilings with the walls and floors of limestone. Upon entry into the tunnel, the architecture is a striking contrast to the modern world of today. Leading off of the entrance tunnel is the casemate. There are 8 of them within the fort walls. 2 lead from the tunnels. The remaining 6 are entered from above ground on the ramparts of the fort. The casemate is constructed entirely of brick arches, the floor of limestone. Looking out over the sally ports are 2 embrasures from which cannon are fired. On the adjacent walls are rifle ports for the use of small arms. Leading from the casemate is a corridor with 3 divisions, the first 2 having rifle ports, the third, a well-ventilated room, used for the storage of powder and ammunition for the weapons used within the casemate. The brickwork within the tunnel and casemate is said to be the finest example of 19th century brickwork in the Midwest. Crossing the parade ground after passing through the tunnel, the eye of the visitor falls on a small stone building of which only the upper third can be seen. This is the powder magazine. The main supply of ammunition and powder was stored here. The walls of the building are of limestone, 4.5 feet thick. The building has been set into the bank, surrounded by an airspace, and an outer wall, 3 feet thick of stone. Between the two walls appear large slabs of limestone which support the main wall. The ceiling of the powder magazine is of brick construction overlaid with concrete. All of these designs were instituted to prevent damage to the fort or personnel if an explosion should occur. Even the door has been set off-center for the same basic reason. The Historic American Building Survey, conducted by the Michigan Division of the American Building Survey, under the direction of Professor Emil Lorch, then Dean of Architecture at the University of Michigan, included in their work Fort Wayne. Drawings of all the structures were made at this time. The fort was declared to have some outstanding early stone and masonry work, and this barracks building to be the finest example of architecture of the period. The barracks was divided into 5 bays. Each had its own door, stairway, halls, rooms, and porches. The building was designed to accommodate 5 companies of infantry. At that time, each company had about 100 men. Each bay had a kitchen and mess hall on the ground floor. Sleeping quarters were on the 2nd and 3rd floors and in the attic. The architecture is of late Georgian style. The walls are of limestone 2 feet thick. A 2-foot stone firewall separates each bay from the other. A large fireplace in every room heated the building. The stair treads are of iron, the floors of oak. No windows appear on the ends of the building. However, rifle ports are present on the 2nd and 3rd floors. This building, which bears the date 1848 on the cornerstone, is in a remarkable state of preservation considering it is over 100 years old. The rear view of the barracks shows the brickwork and porches, which were added to the original building after the Civil War in 1865. And now I would like to introduce Mr. Robert E. Lee, preparator at the Fort Wayne Military Museum. Bob, I wonder if you'd tell us something about our exhibit program at the fort.
Yes, thank you, Glenn. When an area is as fortunate as Detroit and has a perfectly preserved sample of 16th century, of 19th century architecture, and then has the added good fortune of owning that example and using it as a museum, it naturally follows that our first exhibit would be the fort itself. And this is true. And it's a very interesting place with the tunnels and casemates and the galleries that have been described. But unless you are an astute student of military architecture or military history, there's a good deal that the casual visitor might miss. For this purpose, we set up exhibits which tend to explain the purposes of the fort and so forth. And it's here that our exhibit program comes into its own. Many of the interesting points of the fort are made even more interesting when you know the reason behind them. The very existence of this limestone stronghold needs explanation. It is difficult to comprehend a fort as strong as this on a peaceful river border where you can cross freely by saying only where you were born. This explanation begins as you enter the tunnel that will lead you to quite another world of another era. Along the walls of the tunnel we have installed panel exhibits which cover the period before the fort was built, emphasizing the ruling power of the time by means of the flag under which Detroit lived. And while there have been 3 ruling powers over Detroit, we have flown 5 flags. First of all, we have the era of the French, of Cadillac and of his Fort Pontchartrain. At that time there was little danger beyond the need to protect French Indian trading in furs. This fort, situated as it was, could control all of the fur being taken from the Great Lakes area. Fort Pontchartrain served this purpose well until 1760. During this period of 59 years, the fleur-de-lis of gold was the flag flown over this area. Next, with the arrival of the British in 1760 and the victories of that nation over France, we find the area around Detroit under the Union Jack. It was during this reign of Great Britain that Detroit's second fort, Fort Lernoult, was built. The British flag of that period differed from the later edition of that same emblem in that the period predated the Irish entry into the British Empire, and her flag did not yet contain the cross of St. Patrick. Fort Lernoult stood throughout the British reign over Detroit and a bit longer. In 1796, 20 years after the Revolution, Detroit first became American. And at that time it is believed, on the basis of the only written information that we have, that the American stripes, a flag of 15 stripes and without the starry field, was the one which was raised over Detroit. In the War of 1812, General Hull capitulated to the British, and under surrender's white flag, Detroit was again ruled by the Crown. In 1813, following Perry's victory at Lake Erie, Detroit again became American. About this time, Fort Lernoult was renamed Fort Shelby, and it was then that the 15-star, 15-stripe flag was raised over Fort Shelby, never again to be lowered except in favor of another American flag of later design. This last panel will take you to the time that Fort Wayne was originally planned in 1840. Along the opposite wall of the same entrance tunnel, there are a series of 5 cases in which are displayed pictorial material tracing the 5 periods and the 4 wars in which Fort Wayne has had a part. In each instance, a weapon is shown, this weapon being the type in use during the period of time covered. So the visitor is able to trace the simple development of hand arms which were in use by the military from 1840 throughout World War II. While we are on the subject, weapons are given a more complete treatment in a room that we call the firepower room. Located on the 2nd floor of the old barracks building, this exhibit traces in detail the development of hand-fired weapons from the earliest written record of gunpowder in the year 1247 to the present Browning automatic rifle. Excellent examples of the flintlock and Kentucky rifles are shown, as well as early percussion weapons which were converted from flintlocks. And for the first time, many people are given the opportunity to learn what makes a flintlock fire. A specially mounted gun with an illuminated barrel makes it possible to see the lands and grooves which constitute rifling, and through this medium many of our young visitors learn for the first time where a rifle gets its name. Typical of the pieces to be found in the firepower exhibit is this formidable-looking old Colt revolver. Patented in 1850, this type of pistol found extensive use during the Civil War. An early example of the percussion-type revolver, many of its patented features have been passed down to the service revolvers of the present day. Because of its pioneering in design, this weapon occupies a place of importance in the story which we present to the visitor. I think it is also safe to say that every boy who has acted out the part of a frontiersman in his childish games recognizes this weapon as a six-shooter which would almost certainly assure him victory over the lawlessness that he has appointed himself to wipe out. And here is an early carbine. This piece was patented in 1852 and undoubtedly found service in the Civil War by cavalrymen. It is an excellent example of the lightweight weapon which a man could handle on horseback, and while it is not the first example of a breech-loaded repeating weapon, it is among the first. This is also percussion fired. Because we are located in a military installation, we are primarily interested in military history and of those things connected with the military picture. However, partly because we are situated on land which was once an Indian council ground, and also because there is such an intense interest in Indians among the thousands of school children who visit us, we have devoted a part of our exhibit effort to the coverage of Indian culture. 2 rooms contain this material, and while no effort has been made to show every possible item in our entire collection, we have made a careful selection of materials which leave the visitor with a well-rounded knowledge of Indian life. Some of the articles that we have in our Indian exhibit are both obviously what they are and sometimes not so obviously what they are. And I think a very good example is this tomahawk. Obviously it is a tomahawk or a hatchet. But more than that, it's also a peace pipe. Now, this diabolical little object wasn't made by an Indian. It was made by the French or the British and then traded to the Indian for furs. Many of you have heard the term bury the hatchet. And while we can't authenticate this, rumor has it that this is where the saying began. When the chief of one tribe wanted to declare war on another, he would simply present this hatchet. And this was a declaration of war. They'd fight until they'd had all they wanted, and then they decided on peace. They would formalize the peace by filling the top of the pipe with tobacco and smoking it using the handle as a stem. Then the two chiefs would go out into the woods, into a spot that only they knew about, and they would dig a hole and bury the hatchet. There it would stay buried until one or the other of them decided he wanted war again, and at that time they went out and dug it up. Now, as I say, I won't vouch for the validity of that story, but that's the way it's passed down. Here we have a rather simple approach to a very ordinary problem. Each and every one of us every day have to go into the or go to a faucet, turn it on to get hot water. But the Indian didn't have it that good. For him to get hot water, he had to boil it. And many of the vessels in which he boiled this water were of such material that fire couldn't be applied directly to them. For instance, a skin bag. In order to heat water, the Indian would heat this stone to white hot, drop it into the water, and then heat another one, drop it in, removing the cold one, and so on, progressively getting the water warm. Next time you go to your hot water faucet, appreciate the poor Indian's plight. Here we have a moccasin. Now, there's nothing unusual about this. It's just a moccasin, and you've seen probably many of them. It's beaded, purely for decoration. There's no symbol connected with a bead design on it, but I think the interesting part about this is the fact that there isn't a seam anywhere on the moccasin which hits the foot. Very comfortable. Sometimes when I see the ladies cramming their feet into these modern Paris creations, I think maybe the Indian had the right idea. The best example of a good exhibit for children that we have at Fort Wayne is our Army tank. We have a Sherman tank from World War II, which we permit the children to climb in, on, under, around. They can do anything they like with that tank. And I think probably that a majority of our return visitors and many of our first visitors come simply because they have been told by a little neighbor boy that the tank is out there, and you can go out and play on a tank if you go to Fort Wayne. What do you think? Am I right, Glenn?
Well, it certainly is. And Bob, I certainly want to thank you very much for telling us what's been going on at the fort in the way of exhibits, and also what some of our exhibits have to say. Now let's take another look at the map showing the location of the Fort Wayne Military Museum. The entrance to the museum is located on West Jefferson Avenue at the foot of Cavalry, 3 blocks east of the foot of Livernois. The museum is open to the public on a seasonal basis from the middle of April through October. The hours and days of the museum are Wednesday through Friday from 1 to 7 p.m. Guided tours may be arranged by calling Vinewood 37820 for reservations. We certainly want to wish that all of you will come out and take a look and see our exhibits and see the fort itself. I'm sure that you will get a very cordial welcome.
The Fort Wayne story has been a presentation of the Detroit Historical Museum in cooperation with the Detroit Historical Society Guild. Featured on this program were Glenn Stille, Curator of Military History, and Robert E. Lee, Exhibits Preparator at the Fort Wayne Military Museum. It was produced by Solon Weeks and directed by Michael Mooney.